Hello friends, I'm Chromatic Sauce and welcome to my YouTube channel. In today's video, you saw the sketch. I'm drawing a robin with some robin eggs. My inspiration for this drawing was a little nest I found outside of my boyfriend's house, and it had these cute little eggs in it, and I just felt inspired to draw the little eggs, so I just drew the bird that went with it. So the first thing I did was obviously erase the pencil sketch, and then I went in with just water. The water helps the colors blend on the paper a little bit better. It helps avoid the harsh lines. So by filling in the robin with just water for the entire outline of the robin, it'll really help me get down my base. So I'm just filling in water for the entire robin right now. Then I go in with an orange. I think for this orange I mixed a little bit of brown into it, so it's not just straight up dark orange. You can see me kind of mixing on the fly there, and the reason I'm able to do that is because the water I already put down. So I just mixed my colors together. I'm trying to do layer by layer for this one. I don't want to do too much, and I think this drawing was a little bit more successful than my tiger drawing, and you know, it's all learning. Once I was done with that orange section, I went in with a little bit of black. Now, I did film this with one of my 3 that I filmed as I filmed the tiger one, so I had already used the black. For my next watercolors, I'm going to try to avoid black at all costs, just to see how I can make it work and if that will work for me a little bit better. But here, I think I used mostly black, probably a little bit of brown in this mixture. But I just used the black into the wet area of the paper, added a little bit more water to give a nice gray cast to the image. I wanted to fill in the whole dark area, that way there was a solid background, because I knew I was going to go back in with more detail and even more watercolor. So you just see me filling in, putting a little bit of detail where it's necessary, and then filling in the legs. Everything that was supposed to be gray, I made gray. Now I let this dry a little bit before I started going back in with a little bit more detail. If I hadn't let it dry, then all of these little lines I'm making would completely bleed into the rest of that gray area I put down. I wanted to have this grayish black be a little bit more blue toned to sort of contrast the red chest of the robin. I also filled in the beak off camera, but basically it was just a yellow beak, and I did a little outline with some gray as well. And I'm just trying to give a nice base to work with. I really like the look of the micron felt tips on top of a watercolor drawing, so that's what I'm doing. I'm just giving myself a really solid base. Anywhere there's supposed to be shading on the bird, I'm looking at a reference. I shade that area a little bit darker, and I start adding a little bit more texture on this second layer. I really darken it up where it's supposed to be really black, and just take note of anywhere where it's supposed to be much darker. And then off camera, I even added some feathering details on the chest of the bird, just because I wanted to let it dry, and you know, gotta let my camera cool off. But here I am starting on the branch. All I did was take the black again. This time it was just the light gray. I wanted this branch to be a slightly different tone than the robin itself, so I'm just going in with the black with a really thin wash of this black. I do an initial layer where I wet the paper and then fill in the color, and then once it dries a little bit, I went in with a little bit more pigment and I filled in the edges, and I tried to make a little bit more texture by just like squiggling the brush around. I darkened up some areas on the bird and stuff, and then I went down to the eggs. You have to let watercolor dry before you can just keep working on top of it. Otherwise you'll overwork the paper and you'll just make things a mess. So for these eggs, I used once again that shiny blue, I just can't resist it, and I mixed that with a little bit of green. And basically I just shaded the whole eggs, trying to leave most of the pigment on the outside of this. I wanted it to be darker on the outside because these eggs were shiny, so I was leaving the highlights at the middle of the eggs. This isn't really true to perspective type of drawing. The background's just sort of imagery, I don't know, just stuff that goes with the robin. So you see me, I'm drawing the nest here, and in the background I'm gonna have much larger eggs. So the background's not supposed to be a realistic background. And if you see, I was making the nest and then my water got away with me. I probably shouldn't have filled in water out there, but I wanted the nest to have sort of not defined edge. So when the water leaked, I had to get a paper towel and dab up all that extra pigment that was falling off to the edge, because I wanted the brown to remain really close to the nest area and not completely underneath the robin's entire body. So I just cleaned it up a little bit, and I keep adding a little bit of lines around the perimeter of this nest, and I'm going to add a much darker amount of brown later. But once I add those details, I let that dry and I go back into the robin to add a little bit more pigment. Since all of these details and lines have dried a lot more, I felt comfortable going back over it with some more orange. This time I was using a little bit of a darker orange, and that plus layering on top of the part of the paper that was already orange really helped deepen things up. So I just deepened up any parts from the reference that looked a lot more orange, and I just layered that up and let it dry. And that time I didn't add water before I did that. And then, like I said with the nest, I just added really pigmented, really dark brown all around these eggs, just to give the eggs something to sit in, something to contrast. The nest did have a really dark well. As you can imagine, nests are darker in the middle since they kind of concave. And after I used water to help me soften the edges of that a little bit, then I started on the rest of the background. Now, like I said, I'm just doing larger eggs in the background. I don't know why. I always do too much. This is probably extremely unnecessary. I probably could have left it at just the bird, but here we are right now, and I pretty much like how it turned out. I just know I do too much. So I'm using that same shimmery blue, and then I'm going in with the same green that I used on the smaller eggs, just a lot more of it, and I'm just basically blending them together, keeping most of the color on the outer perimeter, keeping these eggs a lot lighter than the smaller eggs. Well, actually now they look darker, but I'm pretty sure I lightened it up. You see here I'm scooping up some of that pigment with my brush, and then I did that with all 3 of the eggs. Then after that, once the watercolor dried, I noticed that my nest was looking a little bit dull. With just brown, the watercolor dries and then it doesn't look as like rich and warm as it did. So I just went over top of it with a yellow ink, and I thought once that would dry, it would look really brighter and a lot warmer and really contrast those eggs in the background a lot better. So once I added that yellow, then I went in with a little bit more brown. I added a little bit more detail in terms of lines on the outer perimeter. I wanted there to be texture here. I didn't want it to look really flat, but I sort of did. Like, it's not made to be a 3D type of effect, but it is made to resemble a nest regardless in terms of the texture. Once that was done, obviously I can't leave any part of the paper white. So I mixed a little bit of light blue and gray to get this nice light grayish blue color, and then I just filled in the whole background with that. And then I thought it was a little bit light, but I didn't want to make it one flat tone of a darker color, so I just added a little bit of black mixed with a lot of water and just dotted it all over, just to add a little bit of texture, a little bit of interest in this background, so it wasn't just a flat color. And once I was done with that, I went over top of the bird again. I wanted to add even more shading, a little bit more depth, since the bird obviously is the star of the show. I just went over with another gray wash similar to what I added to the background, and I just added it to all of the darker areas of the bird. The dark feathers, I just added a complete wash over top of everything, and then I went back in with a little bit more darkness to add a little bit more detail and a little bit more shading in the really dark areas. And then here's the part where there's no more watercolor and I'm going in with gouache. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I think I am. But I'm going in with some white acrylic gouache to add some detail to the bird. You can see I added a highlight to the nose and the eye. I'm adding a little bit of texture around the face. you know, these feathers, they're not just flat things. Every part of the bird has highlights. So I'm adding the lightness that's in the feathers. I'm adding little dots, little baby lines, trying to imitate the texture of the fur, trying to imitate the texture of the feathers. I'm adding highlights to the lines of these feathers on the wing. Every single one of these feathers had a pretty light highlight. I don't know if it was white. White might have been overkill. I probably could have mixed this white with a little bit of gray something, but I think it turned out looking pretty alright anyway. But so I just highlighted basically every feather on this bird, at least every one that wasn't in shadow. Obviously always looking at my reference to make sure it was kind of accurate. I added some highlights and texture to the leg because obviously the legs were very flat, so I just added a little bit of white in terms of little lines along the top ridge of those feet. Then skipping ahead a little bit, you know, I think a lot of this drawing the highlights on top of the feathers is a little bit repetitive, but on the chest I did something a little bit different. Now the bird has these curved feathers on the chest, but I didn't add them in the drawing. They weren't like a solid detail. So basically wherever I did this sort of swoopy motion with my darker gray color to add some shading, I did the same thing with the white kind of along each of those curves. So I just made little sideways little C's to mimic the shape of the feathers to brighten up the chest area and add the dimension against the darker shadows. And then going into the branch, I added little squiggles, kind of similar to what I did with the feet of the bird, but obviously a little bit different. These squiggles have to be a lot longer because the branch is a lot thicker than bird feet. And then I did a highlight along the whole top of the branch, not all the way at the edge, but just at the top to give a little bit of a highlight, a little bit more dimension. And then on these eggs, I just added, it doesn't have to be realistic, I just added a little bit of like a swoop of a white to give a little highlight effect to these eggs. And then the nest, I did it off camera. I just did little swivels, sort of exactly like I did the dark brown. I just did the light white against that darker background, and I think that helped add a lot more texture to the nest that I was looking for. I was avoiding the really darker areas of the brown. That way I didn't completely lighten up the image. I wanted to just accent the lines I had already made with the dark brown while also putting white everywhere. After that was done, I go in with the micron felt tip marker and I go in to add even more detail. I think this is where the whole thing really gets tied together. I'm just adding swoops on the chest like I did, like I mentioned with the white. I added a lot more detail on the face. With these markers, I usually end up liking to do a background outline as well. I'm just outlining and accenting every part where I have a white highlight that needs an edge. Every part that has an edge on this bird, I'm outlining it. And I'm just creating the dimension and the sharpness to make this bird really stand out and look cool, in my opinion. So I'm just cleaning up all the edges, defining feathers, defining some texture. I'm even adding a lot of texture with this. I go in with the head of the bird and add a little bit more squiggly feather details. And I really think this added texture with this marker helps bring a whole new dimension to the watercolor. Because with watercolor, like I said before, you're not really supposed to add a whole lot of black. So if you do a really nice dark gray cast and then you go over top of that with this micron felt tip or any sort of like fine felt tip marker, you can add a lot of detail and a lot of dimension with just the marker, and you can add a lot of depth with the marker without really mudding up your watercolor work underneath. Because too much watercolor sort of ends up looking strange when you add too much pigment to the paper. It just doesn't look right. I don't really know how to explain it. And so I did the same thing with the branch. I outlined the whole thing, not like a solid, like bold outline, kind of a sketchier, featherier outline. Since this is something in nature, Nature items don't typically have a really solid, bold outline, so that's why I left it a little bit more natural, a little bit sketchier, and I think it works with the image. It works with what I'm drawing. It's a branch, it's not a nice hard line, it's a softer edge, it's a more organic edge. So on the branch, I also added a little bit of darker lines on the underside of the branch, similar to how I added the white lines on the upper side of the branch where I added the squiggly lines. And then same thing with the nest, I just added more squiggly lines to accent those white marks I made. And then I even shaded in around where the eggs are. I think I do most of that off camera, but I just added a lot of squiggles, completely irregular shapes, nothing too defined, nothing too harsh, but just enough to really deepen up the area. And this is where I kind of went rogue. This is where it's like, it was kind of too much, but it was okay. And then this is where I made it to where the branches are too much. What are you doing? I added little outlines of branches because I thought that background was boring. I know, there's so much going on, but I don't know, you can't control me sometimes. So I just made little more organic outlines for branches. I just made them up as I went. And then I'm sitting here thinking, these are kind of boring looking. So I outlined the rest of these eggs, and then I went back into the branches to add a little bit more watercolor. As you can see here, I did that off camera. I just used a dark gray and just filled them in. They didn't have any detail because they were just background branches. And that's pretty much how this one turned out. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and follow me on Instagram at Chromatic Sauce. And thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know what you want to see me draw next. I love ya. See you in the next one. Bye!